Okay, welcome back. This is part two of the lesson on energy flow within an ecosystem. We're going to pick up with interaction with an ecosystem. We just got done talking about in part one, we talked about the differences between producers and consumers. That the producers are the ones that create their own food, and that they do that via photosynthesis, where they convert the solar energy to sugar. The consumers are the ones that are going to be eating, whether they're eating plants or animals, but they have to go out and eat something else as a food source. They do not use photosynthesis. They're only dealing with respiration, although the producers also do respiration. Consumers do not do photosynthesis. Then we got on to the idea of what is an example of consumer, and we said there was four types of consumers: herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and decomposers, and what each of those did. So if we pick up with that interaction between producers and consumers within an ecosystem, we're going to get into the idea that it all is based on hunting, or hunting and eating and feeding. These are feeding relationships. There is a hierarchy of feeding within ecosystems. That it is certainly an ordered system, that there are certain things that eat certain things, and that's just a fact of life. It is a very brutal fact of life. We're talking about killing stuff and eating it, which is very different than what we view those interactions being, because we can simply go to the grocery store, pick up some food, and we don't have to think about that something had to have died for us to eat that. Now, those interactions and the interactions within an ecosystem, they're all going to start with what? They're all going to start with producers, right? They're all going to start with the organisms that take in the sun and produce that sugar. I'm going to move the start with over here just a little bit. So that's where it starts with. Now, the energy from there is going to flow from producers to those things that are going to eat it, right? So those things that eat it are called consumers. Notice that I'm using an arrow to visually show that the producers are going into the consumers. The producer's energy is going into the consumers. The producer's materials are going into the consumers. So we're seeing that relationship with between these two as symbolic of that arrow. Now, those consumers are going to get eaten by another consumer. Right? I don't think I can fit the other consumer on here, but we'll go consumer right there. And that consumer then is going to be eaten by another consumer, and so on and so forth until the energy and the materials hit their end. Okay? So now, what is that last consumer going to be? So it ends with this one consumer. Those ending consumers we mentioned as decomposers, right? So this is going to be typically our bacteria and our fungus, our decomposers. So that's where it's all going to end with. Notice that we're always going to be following the flow of energy. Following the flow of energy. That's the one thing about the food chain that often gets mixed up, is that we can see the flow of materials, but you know what? We're really following the flow of energy. That is the main interaction in the ecosystem that we're looking at, is this flow of energy throughout that. Now, that flow of energy is going to be represented in something we call a food chain. The food chain is going to be our visual representation of that flow of energy within an ecosystem, and that we are going to use some arrows. I showed you that already, that these arrows follow the flow of energy. So let's go ahead and make up an example of a food chain. As we said before, the food chains are going to have to start with something that takes in that solar energy. I'm going to choose the dandelion because I had a picture of a dandelion from before, so we'll start with the dandelion being an example of our producer. Now, those producers are going to be eaten by specific consumers. In this case, we're going to have an herbivore. The herbivore, as we gave an example of before, could be a rabbit. So here's my dandelion getting eaten by my rabbit. The flow of energy is going to the rabbit. The rabbit's going to have to eat a lot of plants, because remember, we lose a lot of this energy in the form of heat as this transfer goes on, so it has to eat a lot more plants to get the energy it needs. Now, that rabbit is going to be food for another consumer. This time I'm going to choose a carnivore. I'm going to use the fox because fox will eat a rabbit. So here's my example of the next step in the food chain. Here's my rabbit going to be eaten by the fox. Again, the fox is going to have to eat a lot of rabbits in order to get the energy because of all the energy lost in the transfer. And then finally, that fox is going to die, and it's going to lay in the ground, and it's going to get rotted by the bacteria. And that is my simple example of a food chain. Now, what you have to remember is that with each transfer, each of these arrows, each of these transfers, we're going to lose energy. The energy is going to decrease. Again, the rule of 90% comes into mind, that as we make these transfers, that a lot of the energy is going to be lost as heat, and as we go down through the chain, towards the end, we're going to have not a lot left. Now, we know that that life isn't that simple, is it? Ecosystems are much more complicated than that. So we can't just simply use a food chain here as a representation of what happens completely in an ecosystem. It is one example of what happens in an ecosystem. So we know that those food chains are all connected, and they're going to be connected into a what we call a food. I'll write this in here. Food web. Okay, so it's going to be represented in a food web. Now, if you think of it as a spider web, it has many different pieces of the spider web. It gets crisscrossed and tangled and into a very complicated form. That's what really represents what ecosystems, what interactions happen in an ecosystem. These food webs specifically are diagrams that show more accurately the interactions with an ecosystem. So let's go to the next slide and let's show what an example of a food web might look like. Here is, I chose the Arctic, and I took this picture from the book, and you can see that now we have many different food chains being connected. We can still take a look at it. Here's our producer. It's going to be eaten by the humpback whale, which is going to be eaten by the orca whale. That is a food chain. But we know that that's not the only thing that feeds on phytoplankton. So now here are the copepod, which is going to be eaten by the Arctic char, which is going to be eaten by the caplin, which is eaten by the harbor seal. That is an example of a food chain. But we know that Arctic char is not going to be the only one. It's not going to only eat one form of food. So again, we see these multiple connections. And again, this isn't all that happens in the Arctic, but this is, again, much more complicated than what we saw in a typical food chain. But these are food chains interconnected. When we start to pick this apart, we can start to see that there's certain levels of feeding, and those levels of feeding we're going to call trophic levels. And we can put some labels on these, and again, we're going to have to break it back down into individual food chains to see those levels within our diagram. But those levels are going to hopefully simplify how we see things. First off, the first feeding level is going to be our producers. They're the ones that are going to start with all the energy, so they're going to have a level all to themselves. We're going to see the first things that eat the producers are going to be called primary consumers or first order consumers. Some examples of those would be our herbivores. Could be some omnivores in there. Maybe our decomposers could fall in there. Our second order consumers or secondary consumers are going to be the ones that feed on the primary consumers. Again, those could be omnivores, carnivores. It could be decomposers. And the last order of consumers that we typically see are going to be our tertiary consumers. Again, we can see them as being carnivores, maybe some omnivores, and decomposers will be in there. Let's go back to our web then and see how this all fits together. So if we take a look at this one off to the side, because this will be easy to label, you'll see the phytoplankton. They will be at, well, what would I do? here we go, they'll be a producer. That'll be a producer level. So if we look up then what makes the humpback whale, then the humpback whale then will be a primary consumer. And then the orca then will be a secondary consumer. That's not the only thing shown on here though, so let's take a look at our producer doesn't change. Well, let's go ahead and look at the copepod. The copepod then will be our primary consumer. And then the Arctic char will be our secondary consumer. And then we'll have the capelin going to be our third order consumer, and so on and so forth. So again, we can look at things in those kind of orders. Perhaps the copepod is our front primary, then we have our amphipod as being our secondary, and then our Arctic cod being our tertiary. So again, we have some ways of taking a look at orders, but it's all based on where they happen to be in the food chain. So here's our primary and our secondary, and we don't see any decomposers on there, but decomposers are typically tertiary consumers. And that's going to bring us to the end of this unit. So again, we went back and we talked about producers versus consumers, how a food chain is put together, why a food chain is not the most accurate depiction of what happens in an ecosystem. We can take that and make that a food web. We're putting in many different connections. We take a look at trophic levels, the producers, primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers, and then how we pick those out of a food web. Now, we can see that generally in a food web. We can kind of see some ordering to this naturally as we branch off of our web, but we've got to take a look at the individual food chains to take a look at actual trophic levels. And that's going to be where we're going to end this video. Thank you for being patient with me, and take a look at the next in the series.